The Millionaire's Bet and the Hidden Heiress. Gideon Vance stood at the edge of the penthouse balcony, looking down at the glittering city below as if he owned every light. At 32, he was the ruthless force behind Vance Global, a man who saw everything, including relationships, as a mere transaction. Inside the opulent living room, his closest associates were laughing, swirling amber liquor in crystal glasses. It was during this hollow celebration of his latest corporate takeover that the bet was made. His closest rival and so-called friend wagered $10 million that Gideon could not marry a complete unknown, someone completely devoid of high society polish, and seamlessly pass her off as the perfect corporate wife for 6 months. Driven by his unyielding arrogance and a desire to prove he could mold reality to his will, Gideon accepted. The very next evening, Gideon found himself in a rundown diner on the edge of the city, brought there by a strange online advertisement he had his assistant post. That was where he saw Clara. She was wiping down a greasy counter, her dark hair tied back in a messy knot, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in her eyes. When Gideon approached and made his absurd transactional proposition, he expected shock or desperate gratitude. Instead, Clara laughed. She wiped her hands on her apron, looked him dead in the eye, and told him that his money could not buy her dignity, but it could buy her time. She agreed to the contract, hiding the desperate need to stay entirely off the grid and fund her own quiet existence away from a past she was running from. The wedding was a cold, calculated affair in a magistrate's office, followed by a sterile reception. Clara wore a simple dress that stood out starkly against the sea of designer gowns. As they walked through the grand halls of the Vance estate, Gideon's father, Maxwell Vance, watched from the shadows. Maxwell was a fiercely controlling man who prized lineage and power above all else, and his eyes narrowed with intense suspicion as he scrutinized Clara. He made a snide remark about her humble origins, expecting her to cower. Instead, Clara offered a polite but razor-sharp reply that left the older man speechless, and Gideon strangely impressed. Living together in the massive penthouse was a battle of wills. Gideon tried to dress her in diamonds and silk, attempting to control her image completely. Clara bluntly refused the extravagant gifts, leaving the velvet boxes untouched on his mahogany desk. She told him that she was his contracted wife, not his doll. Their daily lives were filled with sharp words and clashing pride, but beneath the friction, a strange current of attraction began to pull them together. One rainy evening, Gideon found Clara asleep on the sofa, shivering slightly. Without a word, he draped his heavy cashmere coat over her shoulders and stood watching her, realizing for the first time how quiet and empty his life was without her fiery presence. The fragile peace shattered when Gideon returned home early one afternoon. He found Clara in his private study, effortlessly reading through a highly complex, confidential financial report. When he confronted her, the truth poured out in a painful, emotionally charged confession. She was not just a waitress. She was Clara Thorne, the sole heiress to the massive Thorne empire, who had deliberately walked away and renounced her fortune to escape a deeply toxic and corrupt family. Gideon felt a sharp sting of betrayal, realizing the woman he thought he had plucked from obscurity was actually his equal, and she had lied to him from the very beginning. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the penthouse. They moved around each other like ghosts. Gideon used his coldness as a weapon, punishing her for the deception, but he found himself unable to completely pull away. He would cancel high-profile dinner meetings just to sit in the same room with her in silence. When she came down with a sudden fever, Gideon stayed awake all night, abandoning his empire to bring her warm tea and cold compresses. His silent actions speaking the apologies, his immense pride would not allow him to say out loud. While they struggled with their fractured bond, a real storm was brewing. Maxwell Vance had hired investigators and finally uncovered Clara's true identity, along with the fact that their marriage was a farce based on a bet. Maxwell saw this as the perfect opportunity to destroy Gideon's reputation, oust his son from the company, and seize total control of Vance Global. He planned to release the explosive dossier at the company's annual charity gala, inviting the press to witness Gideon's ultimate humiliation. The night of the gala arrived, dripping with tension. Just as Maxwell took the stage to announce a special revelation, clutching the dossier in his hand, Clara stepped out from the crowd. She did not hide. With incredible poise, she took the microphone and publicly owned her identity, exposing the bet, but also exposing Maxwell's underlying motive. She revealed that her own investigation into Vance Global had uncovered Maxwell's massive embezzlement scheme. Gideon stood firmly by her side, signaling his security team to lock the doors. Faced with undeniable proof in front of all his investors, Maxwell crumbled. The media turned their cameras on the older man as the board members turned their backs on him, stripping him of his power right then and there. Later that night, the penthouse was quiet, but the coldness was completely gone. Gideon looked at Clara, stripping away every ounce of his arrogance. He confessed that the bet was the most foolish thing he had ever done, but it had brought him the only real thing in his life. He asked for her forgiveness, not with a grand gesture or a sparkling diamond, but with a sincere promise to build a life based on truth, asking her to be his partner in every sense of the word. Clara saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the man beneath the billionaire facade, and finally let her own walls fall. Months turned into a beautiful new reality. They stood together under a canopy of white flowers in a small private garden, surrounded only by genuine friends repeating their vows. This time there were no contracts, no bets, and no hidden identities. They merged their strengths, creating a new charitable foundation under Clara's guidance, leaving the toxicity of their pasts far behind them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time. The heavy oak doors of the Ashford Group boardroom slammed shut, echoing like a gavel. Julian Ashford, a man whose cold precision had doubled his family's empire in 5 years, stared furiously at the legal document on the mahogany table. His late grandfather had orchestrated a final, manipulating move from the grave. A bizarre clause in the will dictated that Julian had to marry within 30 days to inherit the controlling shares of the company or risk losing everything to a hostile board. He paced the room, running a hand through his dark hair, his pride clashing with the bitter reality of his situation. He needed a wife immediately, but he refused to marry into any of the elite families who would use the union as leverage. Sienna Hayes stood quietly in the corner of the adjoining office organizing files. She was Julian's newly hired personal assistant, completely despised by the rest of the executive team for her lack of pedigree and her worn, unassuming clothes. When Julian stormed out of the boardroom and locked eyes with her, a ruthless idea formed in his mind. He offered her a cold, calculated proposition. He would pay off her mounting debts and provide a massive payout in 6 months if she signed a marriage contract and played the part of his devoted wife. Julian expected her to tremble or immediately agree out of sheer desperation. Instead, Sienna looked at the contract, pointed out a massive loophole in the non-disclosure clause, and demanded double the payout. The ceremony was a bleak 10-minute affair at the city registry. Sienna wore a simple, unbranded cream suit, completely ignoring the expensive designer gown Julian had ordered for her. As they exited the building, a sleek black car pulled up. Vanessa Sterling, Julian's calculating and elegant ex-fiancée, stepped out with a mockingly sweet smile. She eyed Sienna up and down, her gaze dripping with condescension, and loudly questioned how long this tragic little charade was meant to last. Sienna did not look away. She offered Vanessa a polite but devastatingly sharp comment about how some women relied on their own worth rather than their family names, leaving Vanessa fuming, and Julian utterly captivated by his new wife's defiance. Moving into the Ashford estate was a shock to the system. Julian tried to micromanage Sienna's every move, but she challenged him at every turn, refusing to be treated like an employee in their shared home. Tension crackled between them constantly, a dangerous mix of irritation and growing attraction. Late one night, a massive thunderstorm knocked out the power in the East Wing. Julian found Sienna sitting on the library floor by candlelight, surrounded by complex financial derivatives and corporate ledgers. When he asked what she was doing, she quickly hid the papers, but he caught a glimpse of her terrified, haunted expression. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, and for the first time, Julian sat beside her, simply sharing the quiet darkness without demanding answers. The fragile peace shattered a week later when Julian finally looked into the files she had been hiding. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Sienna was a survivor of a predatory financial scheme that had completely bankrupted her family and driven her father to an early grave. Even worse, the scheme had been orchestrated by Sterling Capital, the company owned by Vanessa's family. Sienna confessed that she had taken the assistant job at Ashford Group solely to gather evidence from their shared archives to expose the Sterlings. Julian's pride flared. He felt manipulated, believing she had only agreed to marry him to fund her personal vendetta and use his resources. A terrible, suffocating silence descended on the estate. Julian withdrew entirely, his words clipped and his gaze cold. He buried himself in his work, using his distance as a weapon to punish her. Yet despite his anger, he could not stop caring. Every morning, without fail, Sienna would find a fresh cup of her favorite hard-to-find roasted coffee waiting on her desk, and whenever the board members spoke down to her, Julian would ruthlessly silence them. They were small, silent gestures of protection that proved his heart was not as frozen as he pretended it was. The silence was broken when Vanessa Sterling made her final venomous move. Having bribed one of the estate staff, Vanessa obtained a copy of the marriage contract. She cornered Julian in his office, threatening to leak the document to the media and the Ashford board. The scandal would invalidate the grandfather's will, stripping Julian of his company and handing it directly into the waiting hands of Sterling Capital's investors. Vanessa demanded Julian divorce Sienna immediately and hand over a massive percentage of his shares to keep her quiet. The night of the Ashford Group's annual investor banquet arrived, tense and electric. Vanessa stood near the podium, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy Julian. But as she opened her mouth to speak to the gathered press, the massive screens in the banquet hall flickered. Sienna stepped forward, her head held high. Through the speakers, a crisp, undeniable audio recording played. It was Vanessa, secretly recorded months ago, bragging about the illegal financial scheme that ruined Sienna's family and laughing about her current plan to blackmail Julian. The room erupted into chaos. The investors physically backed away from Vanessa as the media swarmed her. Exposed and abandoned by her own allies, Vanessa fled the hall in complete disgrace, her family's empire crumbling overnight. When the dust settled, Julian found Sienna standing on the quiet balcony overlooking the city. He walked up to her, his usual arrogance completely stripped away. He did not offer her money or contracts. Instead, he took her hands and delivered a sincere, raw apology for doubting her. He told her that he did not care about the Ashford shares or the company if it meant losing her. He asked her to stay, not as a business arrangement, but as the only woman he had ever truly loved. A year later, the harsh corporate world looked very different. Julian and Sienna stood side by side in a bright, newly renovated office building. With Julian's backing and Sienna's brilliant mind, they had successfully resurrected her father's old company, turning the ashes of her past into a thriving new legacy. They shared a quiet, knowing smile as they cut the ribbon to open the doors. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time. The roaring engines of city traffic faded into a dull hum behind the thick glass of the executive boardroom. Sebastian Kane, the unforgiving architect behind Kane Enterprises, watched the chaotic intersection below with absolute detachment. He was a man who calculated every risk, a billionaire who believed human connection was just another volatile stock. But his meticulously controlled life fractured in a matter of seconds. Right outside his building, a speeding courier van lost control, careening toward the sidewalk where Sebastian's young nephew was waiting for his driver. Before Sebastian's security could even react, a woman threw herself into the vehicle's path, shoving the boy to safety just in time. The media frenzy was instantaneous. By the time Sebastian reached the chaotic street, cameras were flashing, capturing the image of him kneeling beside Margot Ellis. She was a kindergarten teacher, her simple cotton dress torn, her knee scraped, but she was entirely focused on calming the terrified child. The press immediately spun a wild narrative, dubbing her the secret angel of the Kane family. The following morning, with Kane Enterprises stock fluctuating wildly due to recent corporate controversies, Sebastian's aggressive PR team saw a golden opportunity. He summoned Margot to his office and offered her a staggering sum of money to play the role of his devoted fiancée for 3 months to stabilize his public image. Margot sat in the leather chair, looking at the check with quiet disdain. She told Sebastian that his wealth was meaningless to her and that she would not be bought to save his stock prices. However, she offered a counter-proposal. She would sign his contract and smile for the cameras only if he fully funded a new, desperately needed pediatric wing at the local charity hospital. Sebastian, stunned by her lack of greed and irritated by her defiance, agreed. Their public engagement was a carefully choreographed dance. At high society dinners and charity galas, Margot refused to wear the suffocating diamond necklaces Sebastian bought for her, opting instead for her own understated jewelry. Sebastian's mother, Eleanor Kane, watched the new couple with undisguised contempt. Eleanor was a woman who measured a person's worth in old money and pedigree. She cornered Margot at a cocktail party, whispering that a common teacher would never survive their world. Margot did not flinch. She looked Eleanor in the eye and calmly replied that surviving a world utterly devoid of a heart was not an accomplishment she aspired to achieve. Behind closed doors, the tension between Sebastian and Margot shifted from irritation to a magnetic pull. Sebastian tried to control her every interview, handing her scripted answers, but Margot threw the cards away, speaking to reporters with genuine warmth and striking honesty. Slowly, the ice around Sebastian's heart began to crack. But he noticed something unsettling. After long events, Margot would quietly excuse herself, leaning heavily against walls, her face pale as she struggled to catch her breath. When he asked, she would brush it off as exhaustion, quickly changing the subject with a sharp deflection. Driven by a need to know everything about his investments, Sebastian hired a private investigator to look into her background, ensuring there were no hidden scandals. What he found shattered his arrogant composure. The thick file on his desk revealed that Margot was hiding a severe, progressive heart condition. The hospital wing she had demanded he fund was not just a noble cause, it was the very clinic where she received her own quiet, agonizing treatments. Sebastian felt a profound sting of betrayal. She had forced him into a corner and hidden a truth that made her incredibly vulnerable. For weeks, a bitter silence poisoned the penthouse. Sebastian withdrew, treating her with a cold, formal distance, furious that she had lied by omission. Yet his ruthless facade was entirely compromised. While he refused to speak to her of her illness, he secretly acquired the hospital's debt, ensuring the board brought in the nation's top cardiac specialists, leaving absolutely no trace of his involvement. He would cancel international flights just to ensure he was home before she went to sleep, watching her from the doorway to make sure she was breathing steadily. The fragile arrangement collapsed entirely when Eleanor Kane discovered the medical files on Sebastian's desk. Seeing the ultimate opportunity to rid the family of Margot, Eleanor leaked the documents to the press. The headlines were brutal, painting Margot as a fragile, manipulative gold digger who trapped a billionaire to fund her medical bills. Eleanor then called an emergency board meeting, demanding Sebastian step down as CEO for letting his judgment be clouded by a sick, deceptive woman. The emergency shareholder meeting was packed with the city's financial elite. Eleanor stood at the head of the long table, demanding a vote of no confidence against her own son. But Sebastian walked in, not with apologies, but with a terrifying calm. He bypassed the podium and projected a series of financial documents onto the main screen. He exposed that Eleanor had been secretly shorting Kane Enterprises stock, funding the smear campaign against Margot with company money. He laid out the absolute proof of her sabotage in front of the entire board. In a single ruthless move, Sebastian stripped his mother of her voting rights, severed her access to the family trust, and had security escort her out of the building as the room watched in stunned silence. That evening, the penthouse was heavy with quiet anticipation. Sebastian found Margot packing her small suitcase, ready to leave now that the contract was inevitably broken. He walked over and gently took the bag from her hands. All of his pride was gone. He confessed that he was not angry about the lie, but terrified of the thought of losing her. He asked for her forgiveness, not with a grand corporate gesture, but by asking her to let him be the one to take care of her, properly and honestly, for whatever time they had. A year later, the towering glass skyscrapers of Kane Enterprises were a distant memory. Sebastian had handed the CEO position to his most trusted executive. He and Margot lived in a quiet, sunlit home on the coast, miles away from the toxic expectations of high society. Margot sat in a woven chair on the porch, her health carefully managed and stable, smiling as Sebastian brought her a cup of tea, exactly the way she liked it. They had traded an empire for peace, and they had never been richer. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time.
Editor. The infographic presents The Millionaire's Bet and the Hidden Heiress as more than a romantic story. It follows Gideon Vance and Clara Thorne through a journey shaped by pride, hidden identity, emotional wounds, social prejudice, and personal transformation. At the beginning, Gideon views marriage as another transaction. His decision to accept a $10 million bet reveals his need for control and his belief that wealth allows him to shape people and circumstances according to his will. Clara immediately challenges this worldview. Although she accepts the arrangement, she makes it clear that money cannot purchase her dignity. This creates the central conflict between possession and partnership. The 8 key moments shown in the infographic trace how their artificial relationship gradually becomes genuine. The bet and the proposal establish an unequal power dynamic, but Clara refuses to behave like someone inferior. During the marriage and their life together, Gideon attempts to control her appearance, while Clara protects her identity and independence. Their arguments are not simply romantic tension. They represent a psychological struggle between Gideon's emotional defenses and Clara's determination not to lose herself again. The revelation that Clara is the heiress to the Thorne Empire changes the balance between them. Gideon feels betrayed because he believed he understood her position, but the truth forces him to recognize that he judged her according to social status. Clara's secret also reveals the lasting impact of growing up in a toxic and corrupt family. She walked away from wealth because freedom and emotional safety mattered more than privilege. Both characters are therefore hiding behind protective identities. Gideon hides behind power, while Clara hides behind anonymity. The infographic's psychological analysis emphasizes the conflict between ego and vulnerability. Gideon's arrogance protects him from intimacy, but it also isolates him. His silent care for Clara during her illness shows that his actions are beginning to contradict the cold image he presents to the world. Love becomes transformative because it requires him to surrender control and express concern without expecting profit or recognition. The social analysis highlights class prejudice, power, and the treatment of women. Clara is repeatedly judged by her clothing and supposed background, demonstrating how society often confuses wealth with character. Her refusal to remain silent represents female empowerment. She does not wait for Gideon to rescue her. At the gala, she publicly exposes the truth, confronts Maxwell's corruption, and takes control of the narrative that was meant to humiliate her. The final confrontation demonstrates that truth can be painful but also liberating. Maxwell uses money and authority to manipulate others, while Clara uses evidence and courage to defend what is right. Gideon's decision to stand beside her proves that he has finally chosen integrity over reputation and love over control. The story ultimately teaches that identity is defined by values rather than status. Wealth may create opportunities, but it cannot produce trust, respect, or emotional connection. Gideon and Clara find happiness only after abandoning contracts, lies, and inherited expectations. Their final marriage represents a conscious partnership built on honesty. The bet begins their relationship, the truth transforms it, and love becomes their real victory. Texto Colado.